Almighty God, we thank you for gathering us this morning to reflect on the text of the Magnificat. Open our hearts and our minds to learn from Mary's song, that we may be encouraged to speak out or sing when and where our voices need to be heard. We share in her hope for just and lasting peace in our land. Strengthen the spirit of sharing, solidarity, and caring among us and upon all the nations. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Good morning.
Good morning.
In one gathering of the Anglican women here in the UK, I came across a book entitled, "If You Can't Speak, Sing." I don't remember if that was the exact title, as I had no time to read it, and that was the last time that I saw it. It only came to mind when I seriously read the Magnificat. I thought that Mary, at that time when women's voices did not matter much, sang a powerful song. Scott McKnight tells us that in the 1980s in Guatemala, the Guatemalan government banned the recitation of Mary's Magnificat because it was politically subversive. Is there anyone from Guatemala here? In the 1980s, there was a civil war, which claimed the lives of so many indigenous people, especially the Mayans. And so it was called a massacre or genocide. And both local and international courts found Montt, its former president, and Sanchez, the head of his intelligence, responsible for the crime. It was the powers that be who instigated the oppression. So this would give us an idea why the song was banned. Imagine pulling down the mighty from their thrones and so on. If that was the case in Guatemala at that time, was it also subversive during Mary's time? Before we dwell on this question, we need to clarify the issue whether it was really Mary's song or not. Sometimes I think that if Magnificat was attached to Peter or Paul or John, maybe there's the question. But since it's Mary, there are a lot of questions. And I think it's also important for us to really make sure whether the Magnificat is hers. Brown claims that the Magnificat is part of the collection of early hymns like the Benedictus, the Gloria in Excelsis, and the Nunc Dimittis, or the Song of Simeon, put by Luke on the lips of the first to hear about Jesus, and Mary is one of them. He admits, however, that in Luke, when Mary utters the Magnificat, she translates this into good news for the lowly and the hungry. Others who support this idea suggest that this cannot be composed by an illiterate Palestinian teenager. So this is more reading Mary through Luke's eyes. Okay, there they are. Some scholars, however, offer other explanations. Foster contends that if Jewish women at that time knew about the messianic hope, and if they, like Mary, were familiar with Hannah's story, remember Hannah's song is always related to Magnificat, it is highly probable that the Magnificat was how Mary expressed how she understood it. Luther, one of our favorites, contend that since God's mercy must be Christological, it can only sung by Mary, not Elizabeth or not anyone else. After all, it is the child in her womb who shows God's hospitality to the world by bringing salvation to those who least expect it. And if Mary personifies Israel, all the more that only Mary could announce that Jesus comes to pull down the mighty from their thrones. So at this point, we can say that whether or not Mary originally wrote or composed the song, we agree that she sang it the way she understood the turn of events, and she sang it courageously, not only for herself, but on behalf of her people Israel. So what does the Magnificat say, and what does it have to do with our theme in this conference? Many agree that Mary's song functions as a prelude to the Lucan theme of reversal. I repeat, reversal. Her life itself became upside down when this young lady, from a young lady to a mother carrying a child who is destined for the rising and falling of Israel. Hence, she had every reason to thank God. Not knowing what her role would be like, she accepted God's call and found her prophetic voice even as early as verse 38 when she said, "Here I am." Now, having accepted the call, she refers to herself as a lowly servant, which may have something to do with Mary's entire package. She is a young woman who comes from an insignificant town and from an insignificant family whose origin is never mentioned. She was betrothed to Joseph, but cannot claim his status because they were not yet living together. Yet God's reversal of her status sets in motion the fulfillment of God's plan. In addition, when Mary refers to herself as of low estate, it is not just a reference to her personality, but a statement of solidarity with the poor and afflicted and oppressed. In other words, she does not only speak about her reality, but the reality of her people. Carman rightly notes that concern for the poor and marginalized is the fabric of this entire narrative, the Magnificat. And so when Mary sings the Magnificat, you can almost hear the poor and the lowly joining her and holding on to that hope that God is in the process of turning the world upside down. The poor, listening to herself, to her song, may be thinking also that Herod the Great, who had taxed them badly, would be overthrown. So McKnight is not entirely wrong when he summarizes the Magnificat in these words: Herod dethroned and Jesus enthroned. And that was what gave them hope. But does this mean that the poor will become rich and powerful while the rich will become nothing? According to Miller, this is part of our limited imagination of the impossible things that God imagines. Mary is testifying to God's impossibilities, and while she does not become rich and powerful, in her lowliness, God's great purpose shall still come to pass. So instead of looking at a vertical reversal, which does not work, which does not solve the problem, Sell suggests looking at a horizontal reversal, which establishes dignity and justice for all persons. The last two verses continues Mary's self-understanding of her place in God's plan. Mary's praise for God's act now moves from what God has done for her as a person to God's mercy for Israel as a nation. Yesterday, we were talking about sharing not only our joys but our brokenness and suffering. We can see that here. Mary's singing in solidarity with her people encourages the voiceless to sing with her and hope with her. By identifying herself with the suffering, Mary also challenges the powers that be. This entails risks, but since God's reversal already started with her, she was willing to carry out God's plan, recognizing that justice for her people requires total reliance on God. By raising her voice in a song, Mary harmonizes her own story with the story of Israel. By speaking out of her own situation, she speaks on behalf of Israel. She becomes a spokesperson for the church. So with all this, I guess we can all agree with Peterson when he says that Mary was not just a womb. Her announcement of a new age, where economic and social intentions are at odds with God's, is related to what the baby in her womb would be doing. The Magnificat can only become good news to us when we share this hope of the establishment of something new and acknowledge God as its driving force. This is also an important reminder in our rethinking our mission. So having gone through the passages of the Magnificat, it is interesting to see how it was understood in different contexts. Brueggemann calls Mary's song the Song of Impossibility, for it deals with what we assume as impossible in this world. As the song tells us, we are often surprised that in a world where God rules, the poor and marginalized see things differently. Green argues that the mere appearance of Mary in Luke challenges conventional understanding of people's statuses and roles, and how the image of the merciful God may be embodied. So it requires what Green calls the conversion of the imagination, as Mary points to a new way of seeing the world. From the perspective of liberation theology, Gutierrez strongly suggests that any exegesis is fruitless if it attempts to tone down Mary's message of God's preferential option for the poor and the abused, and the assurance of God's transformation of history. Balch believes that the Magnificat is strongly political and liberating, as it praises the God who opposes social, political, and economic exploitation of the poor by the arrogant and wealthy. And now, from a feminist perspective, Johnson argues that Mary's song or prophetic speech is also a protest against suppression of women's voices. I should say, or any other voices for that matter. All of these perspectives, old and new, requires an upgrading of our image of Mary and our understanding of the song itself. Could we have missed the real Mary? Actually, I had a hard time looking for an image to put in my slides. That's the only one with an expression. Most of the images of Mary in the internet and wherever we see them are plain, emotionless, So that was the only one with something, with an expression that I saw. So I used it in my slide. How do we see Mary, and how is Mary portrayed in the Magnificat? For most Christians, the image of Mary as meek and mild and silent is dominant. Hence, while some looked at her as a person they wanted women to be like, meek, you should be mild, you should be silent, others also abandoned her because they could not find the fullness of themselves in such image. One important question to be asked is, do we have the right image of Mary? Could Mary be portrayed as a strong and dangerous woman? For how could a meek, somber-faced, emotionless, nice, and mild lady threaten the fabric of the Jewish society and the Roman Empire? In the song, she is presented more as a disturber of the comfortable than a comforter of the disturbed. So while the traditional images of Mary as receptive, humble, and silent, and meek, and mild, and everything, the Magnificat presents a challenge to these given images. As the spokesperson of the poor, the needy in Israel, and familiar with the ravages of life, a strong personality is more appropriate. This is why As I said, I had a hard time looking for an image to show you. Let me give a short practical implication of this. I now understand why Guatemala banned its recitation at one time in their history by looking at all this. And I cannot help but be encouraged to also look at the implications of the Magnificat in my context. So I would like to make a simple presentation of the plight of the indigenous people in the Philippines. I am sure that Father Chris Ablon has discussed much about the lumads and the extrajudicial killings due to the drugs, so I will not be dealing with that. The indigenous people in the Philippines are everywhere, but as you can see, with concentration in the north and the south of the Philippines. There they are. So the colored over the north and down at the south. In terms of mineral resources, the IP lands, the indigenous people's lands, are also richly loaded. As you can see in the map, almost all minerals, especially gold, are also found in most of the indigenous places. This caused us a lot of problems, from water pollution to deforestation to extinction of wild animal life to flooding and the like. And worse, the displacement of indigenous people living in those areas. Mining in the Philippines are mostly owned by multinationals. So at this time, I'm going to give an example which involves the multinationals, and tomorrow, more on the locals. The profit, of course, these multinational companies do not care about the environment or the people around it because their aim is profit. The Philippine Mining Act is not very helpful too. It is favorable to the multinationals than to the locals. As you can see, tax exemption for a grace period of 10 years. Who can give that? Where am I? Oftentimes, and this is true in mining industries and dams or logging, the only participation of the indigenous people communities is what we call the FPIC. Do you have that also? It's the free, prior, and informed consent. So they need your consent in order to operate logging companies, mining companies, or dams. The problem is that even these are obtained illegally or with manipulation and deceit. So even making use of government agencies, we have a government agency which is called the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. But in the recent building of the dam that they're now protesting, it seems that the NCIP or this government agency was made use to obtain the FPIC by asking the indigenous peoples a different kind of question. And then after that, it turned out that the study shows that the indigenous peoples accepted the building of the dam, or allowed. Gina Lopez, she's a very rich, she comes from a very rich family. The former environmental secretary was cheered by many for serving as an anti-mining voice recently. She said, for instance, "To the miners and people who want to come here and rape the country and put holes here and kill our rivers and streams, read my lips, go away." And President Duterte backed her plan against open-pit mining in 2017. He was also very strong. But Lopez angered the mining industry and after ordering the closure of 22 of the Philippines' 41 mines in 2017. She also canceled dozens of contracts for underdeveloped mines and banned future open-pit mining projects. However, in the same year, the Commission on Appointments rejected her appointment as Secretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. So she had the power because her family is rich, but they did everything to kill her voice. So just imagine if a lowly maiden like Mary would do that. No power, no voice. What will happen? Gina, of course, continues to her advocacy, but her power to do more was cut off by the powers that be. So people continue to protest. Men and women march against mining and the killing of people who are fighting for the rights of the IPs. They protest against dams who would not benefit them and who would probably wipe out their villages. Young and old people protest for the sake of the next generation. Then we see the illegal logging that is added to two of these problems. Like the two, mining and dams, the concentration of the mountains and the forests are mostly where the IPs are, in the north and the south. And so sometimes the government or these loggers, the mining industries, would make use of private armies or the military to protect their interests and stop whatever protests are coming from the communities. So this is another extension of the extrajudicial killings, if you may. It is scary because we are losing hectares of lands to logging every year. As you can see, in 2010, forest cover went down by 4.0%. So again, like the minerals, mountains and forests are mostly found in the IP areas. So we are losing that. We are not saying that the indigenous peoples do not cut trees. They do. They also do small-scale mining. But they know how to stop. And they know how to protect their land and trees and animals. The spirit of sharing, caring, and respect for everybody and for the environment still is very strong among the IPs. So my question is, where is the prophetic voice of the church? Of course, in the Philippines, but including us, the international church. Because the mining companies, the logging companies are international. So what can we say about this? The heavy burden lies on us. But what can you say about this also? In fact, I wanted to put the list, but maybe it doesn't complete everything. But I see British mining industries in the Philippines also. So that would also help us. In conclusion, the Magnificat reminds us of many things. It reminds us to give thanks to God for every blessing, mercy, and opportunity, including prophetic calling. It assures us that prophetic witness is for all, not only for the rich, but for the lowly. It encourages us to speak up or sing against the injustices around us as part of our witness and prophetic calling. It calls us to be in solidarity with those who are oppressed and marginalized. It gives hope to those who live without hope. And finally, it acknowledges that God is the driving force in everything. Revisiting the message of the Magnificat makes me guilty a million times. If we are true to our calling as individuals and as a church, we should all be prophets like Mary. If we are faithful to our calling, speaking up for the oppressed and the victims of injustices without fear or compromises is a given. The question is, are we courageous enough to take the risks like Mary? So to end, I have some questions for our reflection. First is, how can we become the prophetic voices of our communities? Are we willing to take risks to give voice and hope to those who do not have it? How can we in the church strengthen, but for most of us, not even strengthen, it's recover our prophetic ministry in today's world? Thank you very much.